My entitled crazy teacher refuses to let me use the bathroom, even though she knew I had a medically diagnosed bladder problem, which forced me to use the bathroom more than other students. But as a result of her cruel actions, she denied me ever having the right to use the bathroom during class, causing me to wet my pants. And as a result, this teacher ended up getting fired. Here's what happened. This story also came from the AmITheA subreddit. Check the links in the description if you would like to submit your own story. So I'm a 24-year-old female, and this story happened when I was 10 years old in the 5th grade. So it was basically at the end of my elementary school experience. Overall, my school life was pretty decent, and I haven't really had many bad experiences, except for this one teacher who we will call Mrs. Jerk. And obviously, Mrs. Jerk is not her real name. When I was a little girl, I used to have bathroom accidents fairly often, and my parents were worried about my health. I was taken to the doctor, and I was diagnosed with a weak bladder. This has been and still is a pretty sensitive issue in my life, and I do still have accidents on occasion. Throughout my school life, my parents would always make my condition known to the teachers and principal of the school, requesting that I would be allowed bathroom breaks whenever needed, and this was allowed by the school and wasn't really an issue for the majority of my teachers, who were all very considerate. And it's right about here that Mrs. Jerk enters the story. At first, she seemed to be all right with my frequent bathroom breaks, and it wasn't an issue for a good while. However, one day when I asked to go to the bathroom, she very rudely said to me,
"No, your regular bathroom breaks are a constant disturbance in my class, and I will not tolerate it any longer."
Now, I was very sensitive about this kind of thing, and I didn't have the courage to just rush out and go anyways. And it didn't help that I had drank a lot of juice at lunch prior to this class. Well, sure enough, 5 minutes later, the inevitable happened. I wet my pants in class. I was so embarrassed that I couldn't even look anybody in the eye. Mrs. Jerk immediately saw this. She got in my face and said,
"You're going to the principal's office for causing a scene."
When she said that, I started to cry and I ran out, crying the entire way there with my pants completely soaked. When I got there, the principal called my mom, and she was understandably angry. And she wasn't angry with me, but rather Mrs. Jerk, as she completely ignored my needs. The principal gave Mrs. Jerk a very clear warning to never do this again, and my mom got me ice cream on the way home. Now, I wish I could say that this was the end of the story, but what Mrs. Jerk did next to me in class has left a scar on me even to this day. So the next day, I was in her class again, and a couple friends that I had in that class comforted me before class started, as I was still horribly embarrassed about the whole thing. When Mrs. Jerk came in, she looked angry and stared right at me, and I felt myself gulp at the moment. About halfway through the class, I needed to go to the bathroom, and I asked her to do so. She got very angry with me, saying that I forgot what she told me yesterday and to never ask her again. Now, I was stunned, and my friends were giving her dirty looks. Now, I was scared of her, and once again, I wet myself in class. And when that happened, Mrs. Jerk absolutely was livid. She started yelling at me for peeing in her classroom. I began crying almost immediately this time, as I hate being yelled at. My friends came to my defense and comforted me, while some yelled back that she should have let me go when I asked to go, and that if she had done that, none of this would have happened. Well, she silenced all of them and sent me to the office again, and also gave me detention. When my mom was called this time, she was furious. Mrs. Jerk was called to the office immediately, and my mom laid into her. I remained outside the office while this happened, so I didn't catch most of what she said, but I do know that my detention was revoked, as the fault lied with Mrs. Jerk. I love my mom with all my heart, since she provides support for my condition and comforts me whenever I have an accident. And she even decided to make me my favorite dinner that night after everything that happened. Fast forward a week later, and I noticed that we had what I assume was a substitute in for Mrs. Jerk ever since that incident went down. I then found out that she had been fired for refusal to adapt to children with specific needs, and apparently I wasn't her first offense. But I'm honestly just happy that I never saw her again, and that our new teacher was much nicer. Now, when it comes to my life today, I have been doing very well since that little incident. I do still live with my parents, and while I am trying to job hunt, it's not easy, as the number of different jobs that can accommodate for my condition are very few. My mom, being the sweetheart that she is, doesn't put any pressure on me to get a job, and says that she wouldn't mind at all if I just stayed with her for as long as I want, which in all honesty, I never want to leave her. When it comes to my social life, I do have one, and all my friends know about my condition because it's one of the first things I tell them when we meet. Sometimes we joke about it, and if I ever have an accident in public, they're always there to shield me from prying eyes. We do laugh about it after it happens, and my shyness and attentiveness as a kid really helped me learn to pick up on social cues. That way, I can tell that my friends laugh with me and not at me. And I'm honestly just so glad that my life improved, especially with the way that I was treated by Mrs. Jerk. Wow, that's an insane situation, and I'm so sorry you went through that. It's so disappointing that some teachers act like this and they just don't believe their students or allow them to have some kind of accommodations. I remember having a few teachers like that when I was growing up as a kid, but never anything this bad. But honestly, it's really cool to see that your mom had your back, and I can only imagine how furious she must have been, because I know if that was my mom, she definitely would have lost her mind on that lady. Like, she would make sure that would never happen again. And it also really rubs me the wrong way that this wasn't the first time that this happened. It sounds like Mrs. Jerk has had it out for other kids in the past, and she's been treating kids like garbage for a while. Like, why would you bother becoming an elementary school teacher if you're not gonna love and respect your students? That is so awful, and she absolutely deserved to get fired. So good for you for moving on from this and finding a life after that incident, because this could have seriously been devastating towards your progress as an adult. If you like Am I the Jerk, you're probably going to love Am I the Genius. Check it out, link down below in the description. Also, go to AmITheJerk.com/submit if you would like to submit your own stories. Am I the jerk for not forgiving my family and wanting to go no contact with them after all the awful things I've endured throughout my childhood and in my adult years? Because right now, my relationship with all of them is incredibly strained, and at this point, I seriously don't know what to do. Here's what happened. Okay, to give some backstory, I'm a 48-year-old male, and my childhood wasn't great growing up. As kids, my sister and I had to do daily chores, and I know I was on the lazy side because I hated cleaning up the house or pulling weeds outside or even mowing the lawn. But if we didn't get them done, there would be consequences. If we completed our chores, we were given an allowance. And I understand that back in the day, spanking was a very common punishment, so I'm not trying to say that this was unusual. But I will say that my father had and still has an explosive temper, and it's something that he has trouble controlling. So his spankings were probably rougher than they needed to be. I had trouble reading until my dad got me into comic books, and they were thrilling for me, and the perfect escape from what I perceived as my everyday despair. In school, I was the weird kid that really didn't have a lot of friends, and the teachers never really cared for me. I always saw myself as the outcast and the one that nobody wanted. So needless to say, my grades were never really good. A perfect example of my father's temper was when I came home with an abysmal grade. Now, I cannot lie, it was wretched. My teacher had asked me to get it signed by my parents, and I knew that it would be ugly when I finally showed it to them. Unfortunately, my father and I were the only two in the house, and he lost it on me. He read the score and just stood over me, and that's when things got physical. And he eventually stopped himself, but I was crying uncontrollably. He sat me down at the table and started going over the test paper with me just to see what I had missed and why I didn't understand the questions. Days later, I was sent to stay with my grandparents 5 hours away, and during that time, I came to find out that my dad had self-admitted himself to a clinic to work on his anger. Now, my mother was, in my opinion, incredibly manipulative. She would always overspend, and they would get into a financial crisis. Again, when my father eventually found out, he would explode, and she would end up crying. She would pack us up, and we would stay with her parents for a week or two. Then they would make up, and this cycle would repeat over and over again. There was one instance where she, or rather they, had overspent by a lot, and she asked me to forge my father's signature, also she could cash in on an investment. By this time, I was definitely over 18 years old, and I knew that once my father had found out, I would be arrested and put in prison. So I told her no. Now, when it comes to my sister, she hated me growing up. When it was time to do our chores, I always waited until the last minute. But when I did work, we always fought. She would punch me, spray Windex in my eyes, or just yell at me, sometimes every single day. I was the annoying kid brother, but it wasn't all that bad. I mean, she had it rough too, but I always looked up to my sister. She was cool and popular and headstrong, and people loved being around her, and I wanted to be wanted as well. So whenever my chores didn't get done, because I was hiding in my room, I never told my parents about what had happened. Therefore, I received the spanking or I just got grounded. When my parents fought with my sister, she never backed down. Unlike me, who was afraid of consequences, she would instead push forward, and it didn't matter who it was. On the other hand, I was the fixer. I wanted everything to be peaceful. I wanted everybody to get along. I also wanted love and acceptance. I cried when people didn't like me, and I simply didn't understand why I wasn't good enough for other people to like me. I kept being rejected, and it honestly hurt me. Now, when I say I'm a fixer, let me give you an example. When my wife and I were married, my sister had my niece with a guy who we later found out was an addict. She had moved in with my parents, and my parents had just sold their house, so they were temporarily living in an apartment. My sister and the guy she was seeing had gotten drunk and ended up getting into an altercation. She went back to the apartment boyfriend, and he came soon after. And this is all while my parents were out of town at the time. They then proceeded to get physical, and then the police were called. Eventually, he was taken away, and she called me in the middle of the night, where my wife and I packed up our daughter and went to her. When we got there, it was a very nasty sight, and we spent several hours cleaning things up. Now, I knew I didn't do it, but my father would be angry and possibly try to attack her for all this going on. All the while, she was on the phone with her boyfriend and his parents, and I just cleaned as best as I could while she sat on the phone telling her side of the story. Well, eventually my parents found out and they drove back early, and my father was livid. When he walked through the door, he tried to go after my sister, but my mother held him back, and I decided to stay behind so the situation didn't escalate. When my parents got sick or had major medical issues, such as a heart attack, I would always go to them and try to help out. I would stay at the hospital, I would go to their home and help out around the house, but I finally hit my limit when I, at the age of 42 at the time, went to their house at the beach to help them clean up after a hurricane. I had to work my job during the day, in which I work from home, and then help them clean in the evenings. I had my phone at the table and was looking something up, and my father started yelling at me about how disrespectful it was. He went on this long tirade for 10 to 15 minutes, and I know it's disrespectful that I'm on my phone a lot, but it's my escape. I held in my anger until the next day when I was helping to cut down some small palm trees. I had apparently thrown the brush away in the incorrect container, and I heard all about it. And when that happened, I just broke. I finally yelled back and called my father every name I could think of, and that happened about 4 to 5 years ago, and I really haven't spoken with him ever since. However, there have been 3 major life events that have happened in my family, which have really only happened to my wife, and I feel as though none of them ever reciprocated the same towards me. For example, when my wife was hit head-on by a drunk driver, my parents watched our daughter, but never really stayed with us at the hospital. I was a nervous wreck, but I didn't have anyone there to talk to. She was in the hospital for almost a week because of her injuries and the surgeries that she needed. And yes, I understand that I probably shouldn't make this about me, since it really did happen to her. However, I was young, and I didn't know what to do or who to talk to. A couple of years after that incident, my wife was pregnant with our son. She kept getting very sick and having severe pain, and it turned out that she needed to have her gallbladder removed. While they were doing the surgery, they also found a benign tumor on her liver that had to be removed right then, or there was a chance it could rupture. Once again, I called my parents, but I was essentially left alone at the hospital. The final issue, after I had broken contact with them, was when my wife was diagnosed with an aggressive stage 3 form of cancer. My sister had reached out a couple of months before to try and reconnect and to see if we could actually mend our bond. However, when I called to tell her about my wife, she ghosted us for 7 months. My mother finally reached out via email, asking if she could do anything to help. She said that she had tried to email me before, but said that she had written my email address wrong. She asked if she could help, and I said that I would definitely need help. However, after that initial email to me, she never contacted me again, but did stay in touch with my wife. My wife had to go through daily radiation therapy for the first month, with a chemo treatment at the beginning of radiation and one at the end of radiation. She then had to have therapy, followed by a full hysterectomy, and finally a heavier dose of chemo for several months. She's now taking an immunotherapy, and she should hopefully be done by the end of the year. When we were sitting at the cancer treatment center and my wife was receiving her final chemo treatment, my sister called to let us know that she wouldn't be at my son's high school graduation because she wanted to be there for her sister-in-law's final chemo treatment. She then asked if she needed to send him a card or a present, but I told her no and to not worry about it. The day of his graduation, she didn't even call or text him, much less anything else. She did call him about a month or so later just to ask him if he had any time to watch her dogs so that she could go to Hawaii with our parents. I told him to tell her no, and we haven't heard from her ever since. My mother did reach out to ask us to dinner since she was in town, and she brought some friends, I'm guessing as her emotional support. And trust me, it was an awkward dinner. She tried to hug me, but I could only ever do like this half hug. My wife invited her to our house because she was back in town, and she brought her friends again, and at the end gave me a hug and said that she loved me. But I simply couldn't bring myself to say it back. And trust me, I know how awful that sounds. I've never kept my wife and kids from talking or visiting my parents or my sister. However, I just don't want to do it. I'm just so tired. My parents also don't talk or act towards my wife and kids like they do with me, and my wife definitely notices this. I will say that my wife invited my mother because she is a saint. We were married young and we've grown up together. I wouldn't be the man I am today if it wasn't for the love and support of my wife and my kids. My wife and kids make me want to be better than what I was yesterday. Once, my father told me that I shouldn't expect him to leave me anything when he passes away, which was just another slap in the face to me. So I really just want to know how other people have handled this kind of situation. I mean, how do I let this all go? How do you let go of the hurt, anger, and emptiness? How do you get over your extended family not speaking with you because your parents or your siblings have poisoned them against you? It makes me wonder if I'll ever get over this, because right now I seriously don't know what to do. First and foremost, I just want to say that this really is an awful situation. Your childhood sounds awful, like seriously, you went through some awful stuff with your dad and your mom, and I just can't imagine being in that kind of situation. But also, the way they took advantage of you when you were older, and they basically made you fix all of their problems all the time, like that really is unfair, and you definitely did not deserve that. And you also had so much on your plate as well. Your wife had so many medical issues going on, while also having scary surgeries that you're trying to get through, and then here's your family literally not supporting you. And based on what you've described, you are 100% right. It seems like they've never reciprocated anything towards you in the slightest. So honestly, I'm so sorry you went through this, but I can say that I'm glad you have your wife and your kids with you to buoy you up and help you get through these really awful situations. Because from the sounds of it, it doesn't seem like your dad, your mom, or your sister were ever really there for you. My creepy entitled uncle is finally being cut out of my life after his wife, who is my aunt, passed away. And after years of dealing with his garbage, I'm honestly so excited to never contact him ever again. Here's what happened. So recently, I was able to finally go no contact with my creepy, awful uncle. And this is because his wife, who was my biological aunt, has now passed away. Now, just to paint a picture of what this man is like, his favorite hobby is mansplaining about things he knows very little about, while standing uncomfortably close to your face, and treats women like we are only put on this earth to serve his needs. Now, here's just a few things that he's done that's led me to making this easy decision. For starters, he threw a tantrum at my undergrad graduation because I didn't make him feel special enough. He was also recently charged with reckless driving for brake checking someone on a motorcycle just to teach this kid a lesson. He also once told me that I'm not fully an adult or able to make any decisions until I'm married to a man. And at the time, I was 25 years old and fully independent. I needed to share some information with him, which I did through text messaging, and he acknowledged receiving said information with a reply text message, but he forgot to relay this information to his wife, which caused a lot of drama. And I guess I was mistaken when I said I spoke with him, because his generation does not consider texting to mean such a thing. And this is still brought up years later whenever texts come up in a conversation with their generation, but I always ask how they would define texting, but they've never given me a straight answer. When my aunt became too sick to care for their household anymore, he dumped her in a nursing home. We were not allowed to get any medical information, but we were allowed to do things that he considered to be women's work, which is also known as doing all the labor, while still refusing to even let us know what care we needed to provide. He often neglected my aunt's care just to spite her sisters. Apparently, he didn't know my aunt required personal care items, and that I should give him some grace because he's a man. And apparently, hairbrushes fell into that category when I showed up and she had not had her hairbrush in over 6 weeks. When my aunt passed away, he wrote the obituary, and it was 75% about his career. It made her sound like an accessory in his life rather than being a person of her own. He also put in the background of the obituary an American naval ship, which doesn't even make any sense because neither of them served in the military and were not even American. A few days after she passed away, he called to tell me how wonderful he's doing, since I would be so happy to know he's doing well. At my aunt's funeral, he put a picture of himself on the podium, with her only partially visible in the background. And the last time we ever spoke, he bragged about how he's gonna sell his brand new house for $200,000 more than what he paid for it. But honestly, I'm just so glad that I'm now free of that man, because overall, he is a completely awful human being. Yeah, your uncle sounds super entitled. This guy seriously not only says awful comments all the time, but he's always trying to prove a point that he's better than everybody else. He literally treats everybody around him like garbage. Who would brake check a person on a motorcycle just to teach him a lesson? I'm pretty sure this guy should not be teaching any kind of lesson, and the only lesson that he's gonna learn is that when you intentionally brake check someone, they're going to get in an accident, and then this guy's gonna get sued. And he would definitely deserve it. Also, the awful things he says and implies about women is just really disgusting. He's sitting there trying to be oh, you're not fully an adult until you marry a man. But it's what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense, especially because the original poster was 25 at the time they said that. That really does blow my mind, and that is so unbelievably sexist. But the icing on the cake of this guy being a complete jerk was the funeral for your aunt, where this guy literally made it all about him. He put a picture of himself on the podium. He wrote the obituary to be like a career highlight reel instead of honoring, I don't know, his wife who just passed away. Like, this guy is a grade A jerk. And with all that in mind, I honestly don't blame you for cutting him out of your life. He sounds like a real piece of work, and in my opinion, if I was in your shoes, I probably would have done the exact same thing. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. To finish listening to all the stories, check out the playlist at the top of the description. And if you want some chill music to put on in the background, check out easymode.com. If you like Am I the Jerk, subscribe to Am I the Genius. Everything will be linked down below in the description.